Okay, hello YouTube, and welcome back to Simi's Broadcasts, and today I am going to be doing part 4 of my series on the regressive left, history, theory, and methodology, Postmodern Pandemonium. Critical theory and postmodern philosophy, which were discussed in the previous section, are not inherently regressive. Neither is the women's liberation movement, the civil rights movement, or other causes for social justice that gained traction in the late 20th century. We are a better polity for our valuing of racial and gender equality and for seriously and honestly scrutinizing our own past, history, and even our deepest held philosophical convictions. There is an enormous gap, however, between these noble endeavors, which are the face of transformation in academia and elsewhere that the public, media, and policymakers at all levels saw, and what was actually going on behind the scenes, where far fewer people looked with a scrutinizing eye. The goal of the emerging political transformation in academia beginning in the late 1970s was not merely to make these places more open and inclusive to those who'd previously been excluded, but to remake the very philosophical foundations upon which Western liberal civilization rested, and at the very least, to turn numerous other mediums into bully pulpits from which to convert the privileged heathen into woke, privilege-checking social justice activists. Outside the academy, the results of this transformation seemed at times comical and ridiculous. Examples are numerous and easy to find in anti-SJW and anti-postmodernist spaces online. The infamous Alan Sokal affair lampooned the excesses of transformational curriculum, as well as exposing its intellectual weaknesses. The curriculums of dead white males were seen as built upon foundations of privilege and discrimination, even as those same curriculums emphasized foundational Enlightenment and liberal values upon which the importance of racial and gender equality were actually based. All of this talk of science and mathematics privileging the male values of logic and reason over the women's way of knowing that emphasized emotion and empathy are easy to scoff at, not to mention how ironically reactionary is the implication that logic is inherently masculine and emotion inherently feminine. Isn't that the kind of thinking feminists were supposed to be against? But the underlying issues are more serious than that, and transformative curriculums became the foundation of what has turned out to be a growing threat to liberty and perhaps the very survival of Western civilization. It is important, therefore, to look at some of the more important doctrines and see how they've driven regressive tendencies we've seen recently. Perhaps the most important, dangerous, and foundational of these doctrines is standpoint theory, which asserts that, quote, knowledge stems from social position. The perspective denies that traditional science is objective and suggests that research and theory has ignored and marginalized women and feminist ways of thinking. Conspicuously and tragically absent is the postmodern admonition against broad, sweeping, universally applicable meta-narratives. The theory emerged from the Marxist argument that people from an oppressed class have special access to knowledge that is not available to those from a privileged class, and is essentialist and reductionist in the extreme. In the 1970s, feminist writers inspired by that Marxist insight began to examine how inequalities between men and women influence knowledge production. We've all seen the footage of SJWs at demonstrations, loudly reminding opponents that
you're fucking a white male!
And otherwise falling back on identity to circumvent argument. This is among the most frustrating aspects of dealing with the social justice warrior and the intersectional social justice left more generally. This rhetorical and ultimately philosophical device is founded upon standpoint theory, wherein marginalized or oppressed identity confers infallible moral and intellectual authority, so long, of course, as the correct party line is being espoused. An intersecting concept, if I may borrow that term, is prejudice plus power, proposed in 1970 by feminist activist Patricia Biddle-Padva in her book Developing New Perspectives on Race, an innovative multimedia social studies curriculum in racism awareness for the secondary level. Besides being as much postmodern wokeness as I've yet seen in one book title, this has gone on to become another fundamental core doctrine of present social justice warrior thought, and is the oft-stated notion that women can't be sexist, minorities cannot be racist, and so on. Here, what it means to be prejudiced is redefined in terms of social power in a self-referential, self-serving, and ideological way. It also gives an easy out for members of so-called marginalized demographics, or their self-appointed spokespersons, to indulge in as much bigotry and stereotyping as they want without fear of social censure. Critics have referred to this as the bigotry of lowered expectations. A related concept is the authority of experience, which relies upon a similar concept of making standpoint on a privilege versus marginalization continuum a determining factor in the evaluation of an individual's speech or conduct. The experience, even of offense or inconvenience, let alone oppression, by a marginalized person becomes equivalent to admissible evidence of racist or sexist conduct, if done by a privileged person, regardless of their intent. The speech-act hypothesis, which blurs the distinction between words and actions, was seized upon by these kinds of feminist theorists to assert that so-called hate speech, or anything that marginalized people found offensive, for that matter, was actually dangerous and oppressive, and thus warranted censorship. So here we have the foundations for the concepts of microaggressions, safe spaces, and trigger warnings. It is all well and good that we listen to those from designated marginalized demographics when they discuss their experiences. There is truth in the notion that it's hard to understand others until you've walked in their shoes. When that's impossible, simply listening is the best thing that can be done. This critique is not a call that feminist or critical race theorists be silenced or ignored. That would be hypocrisy in the extreme. Rather, that we be careful in attributing to the subjective experience of the marginalized the status of moral or intellectual infallibility, and especially of treating their standpoints as license to circumvent essential bedrock liberal concepts, civil liberties, due process for the accused, and so on, or at the very least that it not act as a license to be obnoxious, as is so often done in social justice circles. Standpoint theory is deeply flawed and prone to abuse for reasons that should be self-evident, and personal experience is likewise a flawed means of arriving at truth, for reasons best articulated, ironically, by the social constructionist postmodernists themselves. It is also worth asking ourselves just whose voices are going to constitute the voices of the oppressed and the marginalized. By the logic inherent to standpoint theory, we should ask ourselves whether or not tenured professors in premier educational institutions in the first world countries are really the best people to be speaking on behalf of the downtrodden and marginalized. While there is nothing wrong with having the opportunity to get a first-class education in such an institution, that seems to me itself to be the hallmark of privilege. Social class and economics, as a factor in pervasive inequality, is conspicuous by its absence in much of transformative postmodern academia and associated activism, and is perhaps the one thing about Marx that they'd be improved by adopting. The popular image of the smug, well-to-do college prof telling the unemployed white male construction worker to check his privilege perfectly represents the hubris and hypocrisy of the transformative academy, and smacks of more than just a little psychological projection. For educated professionals versed in transformative theories to graduate from such a college and move on to acquire influential positions in education, media, tech, and other important fields, and then use said position as a bully pulpit from which to beat less institutionally powerful people over the head with their white or male privilege, is an act of audacious hypocrisy that escapes scrutiny, largely due to just how vast a scale this kind of behavior takes place on, as the recent Demore lawsuit against Google is one prime example of, among many. The allegations in said lawsuit cover a harrowing list of abuses of power undertaken in the name of diversity and justified by its supposed challenge to white male privilege. Notice how the privilege of the all-powerful CEO and management over the workers to enable such abuses does not factor into their analysis of social privilege. The use of standpoint theory by decidedly privileged executives and intellectuals to shield their own views from criticism smacks of Lenin's authoritarian concept of the Revolutionary Vanguard Party.
They regard it as this opportunistic vanguardism, the idea that the radical intelligentsia were going to exploit popular movements to seize state power and then to use that state power to whip the population into the society that they chose.
Yet this kind of Leninist ideological institutional capture is precisely what was advocated and practiced by the regressive architects of so-called transformative academia. Peggy McIntosh, who we met in the previous section as the mother of contemporary privilege theories so popular among today's social justice warriors, is quoted by Christina Hoff Sommers in her opus, Who Stole Feminism? Quote, I think it's not so important for us to get women's bodies in high places, because that doesn't necessarily help at all in social change, but to promote women who carry a new consciousness of how the mountain strongholds of white men need valley values. This will change society. Such persons placed high up in existing power structures can really make a difference. When you get through the woke metaphors, what this really boils down to is the capture of institutions and the diversion of their purpose to the advancement of regressive left ideologies. The idea that academia and other institutions should remain essentially neutral and promote clear and critical thinking regarding all ideas does not fly among ideologues who view knowledge and the means of acquiring knowledge as being socially constructed for the benefit of the privileged at the expense of the marginalized. And, as Sommers describes, McIntosh was but one of a vast network of activists who were very good at this. It was suggested that applicants for positions of influence in the academy and eventually outside of it be screened for their ideological correctness. Again, all of this seems alarmingly reminiscent of the old Leninist concept of democratic centralism and a vanguard party. Concerns raised by the likes of Jonathan Haidt regarding the leftward swing in academia find their origins in the ideology of McIntosh and her contemporaries as much as they do in broader demographic trends, though Haidt definitely deserves our support and commendation in his efforts to stem the tide. Sadly, these are considerations that few in academia and the media have chosen to vocalize. An almost universal appeasement on an institutional level has enabled the growth and empowerment of a decidedly illiberal social trajectory, especially among the younger millennial generation. Their success in the capture of academia goes a long way towards explaining the dominance of their ideology in mass media and its control over the discourse surrounding race and gender relations in the agenda-setting institutions of our civilization. It is a mark of transformative curriculum's success that the glaring problems with this cluster of ideas should require so much elaboration. They fly in the face of how we know the human mind works, which would confirm to some degree the postmodern theorist's view that experience is subjective and filtered through the subject's unique psychologically constructed interpretation of experiences and beliefs, of which an alleged harasser could not possibly have knowledge. An educated woman in today's world, for example, duly instructed in feminist theory while in college, could no doubt easily take offense to nearly anything a male could theoretically say or do. A glance being male gaze, a compliment or even a polite civil greeting becoming harassment, attraction being objectification, and even consensual sex being rape if she later reports feeling violated, and so on, although feminist theorists will virtually always deny these linkages if actually challenged on them. Regardless, these concepts have been codified into law as a result of high-profile sexual harassment cases in the late 1980s and early 90s, in which what a reasonable woman feels to be offensive and discriminatory rather than the intent of the presumably white male to offend, discriminate, or abuse institutional power was what determines guilt. Hence the disregard that the Believe Women movement had for any notion of due process. In 2017 and 2018, the juggernaut gained still more momentum, as if more was needed, through the Me Too and Time's Up campaigns. Here we see standpoint theory and the authority of experience deployed when, via the phrase, "you're a male, you don't get to decide," is used to justify an unwillingness to differentiate between the flagrant abuses of power, a la Harvey Weinstein, on the one hand, and day-after regret or bad sex on the other, and a whole gamut of unpleasant but not necessarily coercive sexual experiences in between. The implications of requiring men to be responsible for the emotional experiences of women in this manner should disturb anybody who's serious about the use of anti-harassment laws to actually eliminate harassment rather than be a club in the hands of women in their relations with men, not to mention itself being extremely paternalistic. Implicit here is the decidedly reactionary notion that men are driven by sex, while the morally and aesthetically superior female is above such animalistic concerns, and that women must weaponize access, or lack thereof, to sex as a means of controlling and punishing men. All for great social justice, of course. The extremely sex-negative outlook bodes ill for the future of gender relations, and we are already seeing a tendency towards stark decline in levels of partnering, correlating with age in America and elsewhere. While very few regressive feminists would take this to the penetrative sex-equaling rape extreme for which such feminists as Andrea Dworkin, who would later deny holding this view, were notorious, perpetual emphasis on women's experience of violation rather than of pleasure as being the norm in heterosexuality has led to a dim view of human sexuality. The outcome I suspect, is to place a chill effect on heterosexual romance that we increasingly see reflected throughout all of society. The present epidemic of sexlessness in Japan, concerning as it is for demographers and psychologists observing the harmful psychological and economic impact this is going to have, is where these trends are likely to take us, and the recent spate of Me Too sexual misconduct allegations following the Harvey Weinstein meltdown are not going to help any, and neither are most popular male responses to feminism, such as the MGTOW, Men Going Their Own Way movement, which often comes across as being the male version of the same thing. An unlikely outcome of all of this is the mutual respect and equality across gender lines that contemporary feminism so often claims to be its goal. Thus far, I've spoken of feminism and gender theory, but many of the same concepts are applicable in critical race theory, queer theory, and others like them. Frantz Fanon's views merit a look where race and decolonization are concerned. Here again, we see mere political reform as being insufficient. Wholesale cultural change, in which redemptive violence is suggested to play a role in exercising deeply internalized colonization and white supremacy, is said to be what's necessary. There is nothing wrong, of course, with a historically colonized nation wanting to return to its cultural roots, reclaim its language and symbols in addition to political independence. However, the Mau Mau tactics employed by Black Lives Matter and the South African Fallist movement, not to mention the horrific spate of farm murders also in South Africa, should remind us not to view decolonizing struggles and efforts through too rosy a lens. It is tragic that these kinds of theories may drive people of color and the Third World to learn the hard way, just as Europe did in its wars of nationalism and religion, and later with fascism and communism, that liberal principles are not mere social and cultural constructs designed to legitimize the rule of the privileged, but very much the opposite, a bulwark that protects all people, regardless of color or identity, from the terrors of the mob and state violence. Radical feminism and anti-colonial racial nationalism came into their own on college campuses in the 1980s. A part of their success was due to the vacuum left on the left by the decline of socialism and trade unionism during the Reagan-Thatcher era. Yet they did not suddenly materialize in that time, but rather evolved alongside the broader New Left of the 1960s. And that is where our focus will turn next, in the next installment, Part 5, Radical Ruckus. Until then, these have been Semis.Broadcasts. Thank you for listening. Over and out.